This video is to show you how to remove the crank on the brand new NXT black belt bike. First thing we need to do is remove the shroud screws on the outer chain guard, which are located here, here, and here. To save time, I'm going to use my electric screwdriver fitted with a 4mm hex key. Now to remove the shroud, what you want to do is you want to move the crank to the 8 o'clock position. Okay, now we're going to swing around to the user left side of the unit and we're going to remove the Phillips head screws from the inner chain guard. Screws are located here, here, and here. After you remove the screws, everything should just pretty much come apart. Okay, now that the chain guard is completely off, now what we have to do is we have to loosen the tension on the belt. What you want to do is grab a 10mm wrench to loosen up the jam nut, so that way you can loosen up the jack screw here, and by loosening up the flywheel axle nut, which will allow you to move the flywheel backwards, which is located right here. Now that we have the jam nut loose on either side, what I'm going to use is a 10mm deep socket, and I'm going to go ahead and loosen up the jack screw. Now that we've loosened up the jack screws, next is to loosen up the axle bolts on either side. That's going to require an 18mm socket with the ratchet, or you can just use an adjustable wrench. Alright. At this point, now that the flywheel is loosened up, we can just go ahead and apply pressure right here underneath the tensioner. Mind your fingers, make sure you don't get them caught. And just pull the belt right on out. And then just walk it off. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and take off the crank. So you're going to need an 8mm hex key for the crank bolts. And apply pressure in this manner. Just go ahead and get them loose. And you're going to want to do the same thing on the opposing side. Okay, now that we have the crank bolts removed on both the left and right crank arm, what we're going to use is our CWP-7 crank removal tool, and we're going to go ahead and insert this into the crank arm itself to extract it. Okay, now that we have the crank bolts removed on both the left and right crank arm, what we're going to use is our CWP-7 crank removal tool, and we're going to go ahead and insert this into the crank arm itself to extract it. Key thing you want to do with the crank removal tool is you want to thread it in as deep as possible on the outer walls, so that way it doesn't break on you. Put it in with just a few threads, it can actually break. To ensure that your crank puller is as deep in as possible and fully tight, what you want to do is make sure that you get an adjustable wrench, and you want to make sure that it's completely secure in there. Okay, on the back side of the crank puller, it's a 15mm. You can use a combo wrench, adjustable wrench. I'm just going to use a 15mm deep socket. Okay, so now that it's loose, I'm going to go ahead and pull it off. See this pin on the inside here? You want to make sure that you save this because it does not come with the new crank. Perform the same procedure on the opposing side. This is also the point, now that we have both crank arms off, where we could actually remove the bottom bracket by removing the lock ring here. Once that loosens up and it's already taken off, then you can just blow out the bottom bracket just like all the rest of our spin bikes previously. Sort of business is with your adjustable wrench. You can go ahead and loosen up the lock nuts for the idler tensioner. Don't take them off, but just get them all the way to the back. Now that the idler tensioning spring has actually been loosened up here, what we're going to do is we're going to loosen up the clutch bearing for the idler tensioner, and that is located right here. Here's you'll have to loosen up this lock nut. It's a 16mm. I'm going to go ahead and use a 16mm deep socket to go ahead and extract this. Now that the lock nut is removed, now what we have to do here is for the tensioner slot, you have to remove this 3mm lock nut as well. I'm going to go ahead and use my adjustable wrench to remove this. Once you have the lock nut, both lock nuts off, go ahead and remove the shoulder bolt here. And this is the pivot point for the idler tensioner. Once you remove the pivot shoulder bolt, this brass washer right here will often fall down on the floor. Make sure that you save that. Okay, next, what you have to do is, in this slot here, you have a 4mm hex key. You're going to have to loosen this tensioner bolt. This will allow you to reset the clutch assembly later on when we're going to go ahead and put on the crank arms. Okay, now it's time to install the user right hand side crank arm with the pulley. Make sure that your pin lines up with the shaft. Now that we have the right crank arm mounted onto the bottom bracket shaft, you just use your dead blow hammer to secure it. Now we're going to install the crank bolt and lock it down to 33 to 35 foot-pounds. Perform the same procedure on the opposing side. Okay, now what you want to do is you want to go ahead and we're going to start to wrap the belt. So go ahead and wrap it around here and get it started. Get it underneath here. And get it wrapped around your pulley. Also get it underneath the tensioner. There we go. Get that set. Now you want to make sure that the belt is nice and loose, but you want to make sure that it's also tracked appropriately. So now next what we're going to do is we're going to set the idler tensioner. We're going to line up the big pivot bolt. The idler tensioner pivots on this pivot bolt here with these series of brass washers. So what we're going to do now is we're going to insert this brass washer behind this plate in between the plate for the bottom, or for the idler tensioner and the frame stiffener here. So between this and this, right here in this hole. Now also to mention, this idler tensioner shoulder bolt is channeled. So you see how it has a flat surface here? It's the same way on the opposing side. So that way it fits into the idler tensioner bracket hole right there. So right here is your clutch assembly here for the idler tensioner. Now it's going to turn in this direction. So when it turns in this direction, it actually locks up. So we want to make sure that it does not lock up. That's the reason why you want this idler belt, the tensioner, to be already mounted. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to slip through this washer behind this plate right here and get the tension bolt to marry together with this bolt here, this washer. Now remember, this tensioner here, this tension bolt for the slot, you want to make sure that you have enough wiggle room so that way you have some play. See how this has a little bit of room? Now with the pivot bolt already inserted, I'm going to walk this and basically hold my two fingers, pinch them, and I'm going to get it aligned with the hole for the frame stiffener and then push the bolt through the washer. Turn the tensioning bolt so that way it will actually go through the frame stiffener. So I'm going to go ahead and push the bolt through the frame stiffener. Now that the pivot shoulder bolt for the belt tensioner is through, I'm going to go ahead and start to just lightly cinch down this idler tension right here. Now make sure that the idler tensioner itself, so that was a lot of play, still loose. You don't want to move it forward, so basically towards the flywheel. You want to leave this armature that I'm touching right here. You want to make sure that it stays as back as possible. You don't want it to move forward. Okay, with the idler tensioner bolt in, you have your slot tensioner here for positioning, and then you also have your spring tension. Make sure that this is not off, and you leave it in the exact same position here. Now on the opposing side, what we're going to do is lock in the shoulder bolt for the idler tensioner. Okay, next thing you want to do is the 3mm lock nut. You want to go ahead and install that onto the tensioner. Now, we're just going to leave this intact. Also, I'm going to install the 16mm lock nut. Now, I'm going to leave all these loose. I'm not going to tighten these down yet. This is not the time. Just going to get them hand tight. That's it. Leave it as such. Okay, this is the part where we check the belt, making sure that it is running dead straight and that all the poly V's are in between the pulleys. They're not one tooth over, one to the left, or one tooth to the right. Looks like I'm gonna have to sort out the flywheel there, so I'm gonna move the belt over just one. Cranking it backwards, and that should sort that out. Now it's time to tension the belt. So we're gonna tighten up the jack screw and then lock it down on the jam nut here. The goal is to make sure that the flywheel is even, so remember how many turns you turned on this particular unit. We were at 20, so I'm going to do 20 on this side and then 20 on the opposing side. Hopefully the flywheel ends up straight. If not, we can make some final adjustments in the end. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and use my 10mm deep socket. I'm going to go ahead and start to tension the belt. Okay, I did 16 turns on either side of the flywheel to give this belt a little bit of tension there. So now what it's time to do is I'm going to go ahead and tension up the idler tension pivot or the shoulder bolt. What you want to do is you want to hold the tensioner in this manner, and you want to hold it backwards towards the pulley. You want to hold it backwards this way. And I'm going to use my 16 millimeter deep socket to tighten up the pivot bolt here. I'm going to tighten up this 3 millimeter lock nut with my adjustable wrench. If you have a 3 millimeter socket, this will go much faster. Okay, so now we're going to jump around here and we're going to go back to the idler tensioner spring, and we're going to go ahead and attempt to finish the job of tensioning the belt. Now, to save time on this step, the best thing to do is take off the back nut, tighten up the front one, and then reapply the lock nut. Okay, now that we got the idler tensioner back to its previous position, I'm going to go ahead and apply the lock nut here. And we're going to go ahead and attempt to finish the job of tensioning the belt. The goal is to get it to 100 pounds. What we have here is it's a tool. It's called the Cricut. And this is what actually will measure the amount of force down on this belt. So you see here, it starts at 100. So that's our threshold. That's where we want to be at, is right at 100. Okay, let's see where we're at. Oh yeah, I'm good. Right at 100. Bam. Okay, before you bolt everything up, you just want to make sure your flywheel is straight. You got an even amount of space on either side. Once you have everything put back together, it's always good to get on the bike and give it a good ride. Make sure that you don't hear any noises, any clicking, anything that's abnormal, rubbing of any sort. Then, next, we'll be putting on the outer chain guard. Okay, first things first, let's go ahead and hang the outer chain guard. Just get it in its place. Okay, remember the 3 outside chain guard screws? There are 3 different lengths. Shortest one goes in the very front, right here. Longest screw goes in this location. Okay, and the final screw, the medium size, is going to go right here just beyond the crank. Okay, now we're going to install the inner chain guard. Now to secure it, you just use your 3 Phillips head screws, which go in locations, this first location, this location, and down here below. Now you're going to secure the front outside screws again, and you're good to go.